A year ago, I interviewed Michael Bernstein, who's an economist and head of Canadians for Clean Prosperity, about border carbon taxes. And they really weren't much on the public agenda at that time, but they are now. And because US President Joe Biden is talking about it for the US, but it's much bigger than that. And we're going to talk to Michael again to get an update on where sort of the leading nations, developed nations, are headed in this direction. So welcome to the interview, Michael.
Good to be with you.
Look, why don't you give us the big picture on where border carbon taxes are these days?
Yeah, I think in the last couple of months, we've seen a growing momentum towards developing a coordinated approach across the G7, perhaps even broader than that, around border carbon adjustments. The leading player here is the European Union. They have, for over a year, been making it very clear that they intend to pursue a border carbon adjustment, and they are going to have a specific proposal later this year that they hope to implement by 2023. So they're really the leader here. But in the last few months, we've seen a lot of interest in this from a number of other really important centers of power. The US would be a good example. Joe Biden has made it clear in his climate platform that one of the things he intends to do is to impose a border fee on imports from places that he perceives to be low performers on climate. So there's some interest there. Then you also have some interest coming out of the UK from Boris Johnson, where he has said this will be one of the issues that he wants to stake his leadership of the G7 on this year. In other words, he wants to see if he can get the G7 countries to agree to some sort of framework. And even as you move eastward, you now have word out of Japan that they are considering a border carbon adjustment. So I think for all of those reasons, you're going to see more and more talk about border carbon adjustments this year and in the coming years.
Now, Canada, of course, is getting involved in this because the Environment Minister Jonathan Wilkinson was asked a question by a reporter, and he said, "Yeah, we're already in talks with the Biden administration. See where it goes." So it sounds to me like there's indicators out of Ottawa that the Trudeau government will kind of align its climate policy so they're consistent with the Biden administration. And if Biden goes ahead, should we expect a border carbon tax in Canada?
I think we should, and I think it's really a question of when rather than if. From Canada's perspective, it is absolutely in our interest to try to align with the US and to coordinate our approach. Obviously, we have a very extensive trading relationship with the United States, so it will be quite difficult for us to move without some sort of coordination with them. But it's also very much, I would argue, in our own interest, because we know the world is moving this way. And the sooner we can give our businesses certainty about where we're headed and apply a more fulsome carbon tax domestically as part of that, the greater encouragement and the more progress we'll make in decarbonizing our sectors and our Canadian businesses to be ready for that future world where carbon will be priced in international trade.
I've often heard it asked on social media, why do Canadian oil and gas producers pay a carbon tax when imports from places like Saudi Arabia do not? So just to make it clear, the border carbon tax would then now tax Saudi Arabian oil, for example. But doesn't this cut both ways? Because you take the Alberta oil sands, heavy crude that goes down to the US. I mean, presumably Biden's new border carbon tax would apply to that crude, which is very, very carbon intense. And that might not be the best thing.
Yeah, so that you're absolutely right about that. This would levy fees on imports, but for sure, the oil and gas industry is a really important consideration. So I guess the question really becomes, what is the best way to prepare for a world in which we are going to have these kind of border carbon fees? If you believe, as I do, that the oil and gas sector in Canada will be subject to these fees, then the question really becomes, would we rather see the US government taxing our producers and taking that money for their own purposes? Or would it not be better for us to tax those producers ourselves, work with them to figure out a use of that revenue that may help them actually decarbonize more quickly, and thus prepare them for the world that we are going to face, whether we like it or not. So for that reason, I think while this is a risk to the oil and gas sector, I actually think the greater risk would be not to prepare for this eventuality and not to help our industry have the best chance of succeeding in a world with border carbon adjustments.
And we should probably mention for viewers that the Canadian large emitter tax, and the one, for instance, in Alberta, that's equivalent to the federal, has been approved by the federal government, does not charge the full 100% carbon price. I mean, it's an energy intensive trade exposed industry, and it gets up 80 or 90% discount off the carbon price. Is that correct, Mike?
That is correct. Yeah. So today it's 80% typically discount, as you say. And so that makes sense today in a world where so much of that product is being exported and competing with other goods where a carbon tax or other carbon regulations don't apply. So I think in today's environment, there is a logic to doing that because it still does give them an incentive to reduce emissions, but without being overly punitive, where you risk really sacrificing that production and losing it to other countries. They're not eliminating any carbon in the process, just hurting the Canadian economy. So there's a logic to that, but that is exactly what we need. We now need to chart a path from that system to a system that applies a fuller price, but applies a border carbon adjustment to make things fair at a global level for our exporters.
So that raises the question, if the Canadian, could be oil producers, could be manufacturers, anybody that's exporting into the United States, and the Canadian companies are already paying some form of carbon tax, then how does that get accounted by the Americans so that the Canadian companies aren't taxed twice?
Yeah, so this is exactly why we need to negotiate with our American partners, because there isn't a clear answer to that today. And it is only through discussions and working with our US counterparts that we can hopefully come to some agreement. It certainly is possible that we could make the case and win the argument that our current policy is sufficient to avoid a border carbon fee. But given the stakes involved in this issue, it seems to me that it would be a better strategy for us to get out ahead of this, start to develop a plan, not necessarily apply it today, but have the plan in place, working with industry for how we're going to get to a fuller price, which surely would avoid that border carbon fee. And that way we'll be ready for this future world. Because look, even if we don't get there in the first term of a President Biden administration, I think given all of the momentum we see on border carbon adjustments all around the world, it seems clear to me that we will have these fees at some point, and we ought to be prepared.
Just a final point, Michael, and that is, when I was writing my 2019 book on the oil sands, I interviewed companies like Suncor, who were reducing and are reducing their greenhouse gas emissions because they were looking ahead into the future when they would have to pay a carbon tax going into either existing markets or into future markets, like everybody was expecting China to have a carbon market in the near future. But I don't think anybody expected that to arrive as quickly as it has.
Agreed. Yeah, China, as you know, has a carbon market already in place today for the power sector. There are some challenges with the design of that market. Maybe we can talk about that another day, but they are taking really encouraging steps. They need to do a lot more, but it's clear where they're going. And so look, there is global momentum here around this, and Canada has not only made progress in the oil and gas sector, but of course we have many companies and many sectors where we can be very competitive in a world that prices carbon. But we've got to have, like every country does, we've got to have the right policies to support our industry to get to that decarbonized future. And I think this is going to be a really important part of that, as long as it's paired with domestic carbon pricing that continues to rise.
Michael, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Great to talk to you.